One of the things that we're going to be doing this afternoon is sort of working through both slides and stata code kind of simultaneously. So I wrote this do file that's not too long. I think it's posted on the website, but didn't necessarily come in the email, so just make sure that you can find that. Okay, for today in the workshop, we're going to be talking about principal stratification. In the first part of my presentation today, it's going to feel like, it's always good to like start where everybody feels comfortable, right? So we're going to still for a while be talking about sort of the standard IV setup of how you handle non-compliance with randomization. But we're going to use that as an entree into, and you can think about that IV setup when you think about compliers and never takers and always takers. In the vocabulary that I'm going to use today, people who are compliers and people who are never takers and people who are always takers or defiers, we will refer to those different groups as principal strata, as subgroups within the data that we're looking at. And so I'm going to start in the space of simple non-compliance, which again we're all hopefully pretty familiar with now. But what we're going to transition to is generalizing that kind of way of thinking to other problems, other more complex problems that we might be interested in tackling. And so I think that you'll see a lot of connections to what we heard from Howard and Sean and Steve in the first 2 days. You'll see a lot of connections to what Guanglei is going to be presenting tomorrow. So hopefully you'll be able to make some of those connections in your mind. But if you want to think about principal stratification in a general way, you can think about using these frameworks of sort of identifying compliers and non-compliers and just sort of generalizing that way of thinking to a much broader set and different classes of types of questions that you might care about. So this morning, I'm going to do some general setup, and then we'll think about how to set up and structure problems in a principal stratification framework. So the morning will be all about sort of setup. And then in the afternoon, we'll talk about, so the setup is the sort of beautiful, elegant, lovely, like if you like matrix algebra, because it's so elegant and clean, you're going to like this, right? At least I do. Like setting up problems with a principal stratification framework I find very satisfying. But estimation is sort of a pain in the ass. And so we're gonna leave estimation to the afternoon. So that's where it all kind of goes out the window and you need to figure out what you're going to do. Okay. I want to acknowledge in the different things that we're going to be talking about today. A lot of this work has been developed in collaboration with this fine group of folks. I should also note that Luke Miratrix, he happens to be in California right now, so he's going to be rolling in sometime mid-morning and presenting some things in the afternoon, so that's great. Okay, I just talked through that. So just to get us started, you're all very familiar with the potential outcomes framework. So just to remind you, if we think about this grid as a sort of a complete data problem, so Don Rubin would talk about this kind of setup as a sort of potential outcomes or estimating causal effects is really a missing data problem, right? So we have all of these individuals, 1 through whatever in our data, and each individual has 2 potential outcomes in the context of our randomized trial. They can have an outcome if they're assigned to treatment. They can have an outcome if they're assigned to control. And of course, we're not going to observe everybody's potential outcome under both scenarios. We're only going to observe their first potential outcome if they're assigned to treatment, their second potential outcome if they're assigned to control. Okay? Okay. We can think about individual treatment effects as the difference between these 2 potential outcomes, and we can think about an average of these individual treatment effects. And of course, we can't observe these things directly in our data because of this missing data problem, but we can, under certain circumstances, estimate all of these things. So just to walk through a few things. Oh, 2 other things that I want to say. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. So everything's always better as a conversation. And then the other thing, ladies in the room, I just want to say that I've noticed that you've been comparatively quiet these past couple days. Now, I know that's a trait. I'm with you. But like, now's the time to get over that. Okay, just a little encouragement. Okay, so in our potential framework, or potential outcomes framework, we have some key assumptions that allow us to estimate the treatment effects that we care about, even when we can't observe all of the potential outcomes. This is the thing that we might want to start out estimating, just the difference, or the average of the difference between our two potential outcomes. And under ignorability, under basically random assignment, we can re-express this as the y1 conditional on assignment to the treatment condition, and the y0 conditional on assignment to the control condition. Okay, so just mathematically what's going on with ignorability. The second assumption, and Sean talked about Sutra yesterday, and I know it's something that you've learned about already. The second assumption that we're going to rely on is Sutra. So Sutra tells us that the observed outcome for each individual is a function of their potential outcomes and random assignment, and is not dependent on the assignment of other individuals. So the Sutra assumption is really, really fundamental to principal stratification, and I'll come back to it in a couple of ways. But one way that might not seem intuitive initially, but one way to think about the Sutra assumption is that potential outcomes for an individual are essentially a pretreatment characteristic in a way, right? The Sutra assumption is saying it's already sort of a preordained fact of how you're going to respond if you're assigned to treatment and if you're assigned to control, right? The only thing that randomization controls is which of your potential outcomes we actually get to observe, right? So that's just sort of another way of thinking about the Sutra assumption. Because of that assumption, we can basically express the observed outcome for every individual as a function of your potential outcome under treatment and assignment to treatment, and your potential outcome under control and assignment to control. And under Sutra, we can re-express this difference that we care about in terms of the observed y's rather than the actual potential outcomes. Okay? Everybody good with that? Yeah. Okay. So this is obviously our expression for our ITT effect, the causal impact of the outcome on being assigned to treatment. But of course, we always want to be thinking beyond just that ITT effect. And sometimes, especially in principal stratification, we're interested in assessing other things, such as the impact on those who would actually take up the treatment. So compliance is one kind of post-treatment intermediate behavior. So in principal stratification in general, this is a framework that's going to be useful if you want to be asking the kinds of questions of sort of what are the impacts for people who would respond this way versus for people who would respond this way, right? So we'll look at lots of different examples of this. So compliance is one of those kinds of questions. So what's the impact of assignment to treatment for people who are going to comply with whatever I assign them to versus people who are going to do something different from what I would ideally have them do? Okay? So principal stratification helps us to think in a really organized way about all sorts of different post-treatment intermediate behaviors. Okay, so we had this sort of complete data framework. Here's our ID numbers for our students, our potential outcomes. And so we want to expand this to think not just about potential outcomes, but also about potential intermediate behaviors. Okay? So the structure is exactly the same. Here's still our randomization indicator. So we can think about, or when we're in the principal stratification framework, we want to think really, really clearly about potential intermediate behaviors. Some people might call these potential values of a mediator, but we'll just for now call them potential intermediate behaviors. So we would want to think about whatever this key behavior is, for now we're going to think about compliance. So how would they react? Would they engage in the treatment or not under assignment to the treatment condition? And how would they react under assignment to the control condition? Okay, so we want to think about what that key behavior would be under assignment to treatment and under assignment to control. Okay, so now we're just going to walk through a little thought experiment so that we can define our principal strata really carefully. So we want to suppose that our intermediate behavior is binary. It could be treatment take-up. It could also be, were you in a sort of high-quality setting or were you in a low-quality setting of whatever sort of educational environment that you care about, right? It could be, did you graduate from high school? Did you not graduate from high school? That might be an intermediate behavior if we're interested in thinking about what's the impact on some sort of college success program on whether kids complete high school and then go on. So we're talking about compliance here, but of course in educational settings there are all sorts of binary sort of intermediate things that happen that substantively we care about, right? So you can be thinking of your favorite binary intermediate outcome and sort of as I'm walking through this simplest example, maybe you can be thinking also about how might I translate a research question that I have in this kind of structure. Okay, so let's suppose that our intermediate behavior is binary. And we're going to talk about treatment take-up here. And suppose for the time being that we're sort of omniscient, we're able to observe both potential intermediate behaviors for each person. So if we could do that, if we were in the world of complete data, then we have perfect information. We can classify everybody in terms of the group that they belong to. Okay, so here are our compliers. They're those who take up the treatment under treatment and don't under control. We have our always takers. They're always going to take up our intervention or whatever it is. We have our never takers and then our defiers. So again, if we're in this space of complete data, you could imagine that we could just define subgroups based on these intermediate behaviors and estimate treatment effects within our subgroups, right? And everything would be wonderful, but we can't. Okay, so in the language of principal stratification, so you've probably like had this vocabulary in the space of instrumental variables, but in the language of principal stratification, this is an example of a set of principal strata. Sean? Well, if you knew who they were and membership in those groups is uncorrelated with treatment assignment. Oh, I see. So it really, so maybe another way of thinking, well, I don't know if this is what you were thinking about, but I'm going to try. So this is a post-randomization behavior. We're thinking about post-randomization behaviors. Remember when I first started talking about Sutra, we said, in a way, what Sutra is telling us is that the values of your potential outcomes are sort of preordained features of yourself, right? Just as, and I think I formally have this on a slide somewhere else, just as whether you're a complier or an always taker is a preordained feature of yourself, right? So in a way, because of that, because of the Sutra assumption, we can think of membership in these different groups as a baseline characteristic. And that's what the Sutra assumption gives us. Yeah?
Yeah, so I think what confusing me is that we often hear the terms compliers always taken compliers in the context of IP.
Yep.
Where the exclusion restriction says treatment effect for the always takers is 0.
Right.
So I was getting confused about how you were going to estimate it, because in the back of my head I'm assuming 0 because I'm in IP, but this would apply in any given design.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So I want to relate it to IV, and you'll see where. So IV is going to rely on monotonicity and exclusion restrictions to estimate that complier average causal effect or that complier average treatment effect. And so we'll get there, and I'll show you very explicitly where those assumptions come in for the sake of estimation. But just for the sake of defining the groups that we care about and defining the estimands or the parameters that we want to estimate, we don't, just for the, right now we're in the state of defining things that maybe we care about without placing any restrictions on them. But those restrictions will be a very important piece of the process as we move forward. Yeah. So what's interesting, and this is what's so like beautiful about it, right? This is why I have like a religious moment when I'm talking about it. We can't necessarily know who those individuals are, but in certain circumstances, we can estimate things about them. And so we'll get there. So there are certain cases where you can know who some people are, but you can't necessarily know what group everybody belongs to. And so what we're going to do, particularly in the afternoon when we get to estimation, is we're going to focus exclusively on like what can we point identify, and then if we can't point identify, what can we put bounds around. And so we'll see that there are some things, some sort of characteristics of the groups, and some estimates of outcomes that we can actually point identify. We just can't get everything. So when there are things that we want to know that we can't estimate, point estimate, we'll bound them. Yeah. Was there another hand? No? Just giving it a second. Okay. Okay. So in the language of principal stratification, you've obviously had this vocabulary already. But in the language of principal stratification, we're going to refer to those groups, even though they're latent, even though we can't know what everybody is, we're going to refer to those groups as our principal strata. And so very generally, when you use principal stratification framework, you're going to define the groups that you care about, basically with answers to these two different questions, right? So there's sort of counterfactual reasoning that goes on. For every individual in your data, in your population, whatever, you want to ask, what were the individual's intermediate behaviors given their randomized treatment assignment, right? And that's something that we can observe. But to define the strata, we also need to ask the counterfactual to that. So what would their intermediate behavior have been had they been assigned to the alternate experimental condition? Right? And so it's the answers to these two questions. What did the person do? And what would the person have done under the other random assignment that you use to define the strata that you care about?
So just to connect it to yesterday, so when I was talking yesterday about the gammas, like person-specific gammas, the effective treatment on the mediator, the gammas would be the difference between 1 and 2.
That's right.
So in the framework I was using, in some ways you never sort of cared about what the values of these intermediate things were. You just cared about the difference between. But your strata are really defined
By the actual values. Yep, exactly, exactly. One thing, this is just something that comes to mind in the data example that you had yesterday, when you had the schools that had really, really low compliance. Maybe this is why I thought about it, but I had wondered if those were settings in which actually everybody above the threshold also was getting double dose for some reason. Or anyway, something to think about.
We talked about this in our group. Maybe a school, 90% of the students fall below the threshold, but not enough above to have a single dose of that.
Right.
Everyone's got the same value of this intermediate outcome.
Right, exactly, exactly. Any other questions or things that you have to spiritually shout out right now? No? Okay. All right. Okay, so this is just reiterating this point about how Sutra comes in when we think about strata membership. So here's the expression that you saw already for the observed value of the outcome. For every individual, that observed value is simply a function of their individual randomized treatment assignment and their potential outcomes, right? So now I just want to add to the slide that the same thing applies to that intermediate behavior, right? So the intermediate behavior that we observe for an individual student is just a function of randomized treatment assignment and their potential values of that intermediate behavior, right? So that says that if you're thinking about for example, some school level intervention, if I'm in a school level intervention, how you assign my best friend has no bearing on what I'm going to do and has no bearing on what my eventual outcomes are going to be, right? So another way of saying this is that how an individual responds to the offer or lack thereof of a particular treatment is a characteristic of the individual, and it's not influenced by the randomization of others, right? So the key takeaway from this is that principal stratification assumes, and I'm going to contrast this, or I want to flag for you, this is in contrast to the way that Guanglei is going to be talking about these kinds of things tomorrow. But principal stratification makes the assumption that compliance type, as defined by these joint potential values of that intermediate behavior, is a pre-treatment covariate, right? That I'm a complier is completely a feature of me, right? I'm kind of a complier. So even though we can't fully observe these things, the group that you belong to is a characteristic of you, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Is it a function of you and the context in which you're in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it could be the case that if you were assigned to some kind of treatment here at Stanford, you would respond one way. But say you were at Harvard instead and you got assigned to that treatment, maybe you would react differently in that particular context. Of course, we're not going to think about what you would look like in this intervention in 12 different contexts. We're just going to consider you in the particular context that you're in. So you're absolutely right that this is a very strong statement, and so absolutely it's context specific, but we feel okay with that.
There's context and intervention, right? So it could be one intervention in 12 places, but also just like in this intervention, it might be a complier in that one.
Exactly. So this is sort of a simplification, but you could, right, we're thinking about individuals in their particular context. You know, a lot of the sort of initial work or thinking on this was more in the space of, like, I think the Frangakis and Rubin paper, their first paper was in the context of like biomedical interventions. So you think about the very simplistic idea of treatment is taking an aspirin or not, right? And whether you're, well, maybe altitude would have something to do with it, right? But whether you're in San Francisco versus Palo Alto taking that aspirin, it's probably, you're going to react the same way. Okay, great. Anything else? Questions are good. We're off to a good start. Yeah.
So then, I guess it appears that also get assigned to different characters from your context, because isn't that kind of like maybe simple kind of?
Absolutely. So one other thing, so I'll say something generally and then get back to that. One other thing that I really like about the principal stratification framework is you'll see throughout the day that it forces you to be really explicit about your assumptions and where those assumptions are coming in, right? And so Sutra is one of those assumptions that is sort of fundamental to this notion that if we want to relax Sutra, we would need to think about, well, how is Oded going to respond if his best friend is assigned versus not, or his 10 best friends are assigned versus not? And then you could think about so many different potential intermediate behaviors. You can see how that really complicates the situation. So that's the sort of downstream effect of relaxing the Sutra assumption. There has been some work looking at how you do relax that assumption. I'm not gonna go into that now, but I can find some citations for you. In one of our papers that I put on the reading list, we at least have some citations in there. So there has been some work done to explore what it takes again to relax that assumption. But for now, we're gonna hang on to it, if that's okay. But it's true that especially if we mostly care about interventions in educational settings, where the interventions are happening during the school year and assignment is at the individual level, it's an assumption that we should really sort of pause and think hard about, because it's not, like, everything relies on it, but it may or may not actually be a reasonable assumption in that kind of setting.
Well, that's kind of why I'm asking if you think about peers as part of treatment, right? So,
Yeah.
like, treatment is not actually just taking some new math class. It's like taking a math class in this school with these students.
Right. So it could also be part of what you define the actual treatment to be. Yeah. Okay to go on? Everybody with me? Okay. So far we've said compliance type is basically a pretreatment covariate. It's a pretreatment covariate just like something like gender is a pretreatment covariate, right? So for our pretreatment covariates, we could think about conditioning our data on that pretreatment covariate, and for example, estimating an ITT effect for our males and an ITT effect for our females. Okay? And so within these subgroups, one other thing that's important to note, within these subgroups, males and females, the ITT effect is a causal effect, right? It's the causal effect of treatment for males and the causal effect of treatment for females. And we may find, when we compare our estimates of those two ITT effects, that we may find differences in those causal effects. When we compare those causal effects between the two subgroups, that's inherently a descriptive exercise, right? So the within-group comparisons are causal treatment effects, but when we're comparing the effect of a treatment for males versus the effect of a treatment for females, comparing those effects is descriptive, right? We can say that the effect was larger for females than it was for males, but we don't know if that's inherently caused by gender. It's just related to gender. Okay? So we can do exactly the same thing. We can express the same kinds of ITT effects of interest for our different principal strata, right? We can express an ITT effect for our compliers, for our always takers, our never takers, and our defiers. So we can express those things in theory. We just don't always observe the groups that people belong to, and so that's the challenge that we'll face in estimation. Okay. So I just want to underscore again that these ITT effects, these subgroup treatment effects, are causal effects, but when we compare those causal effects across groups, we're making a descriptive comparison. Yeah. So Luke's here. Okay. So that's an assumption. And sometimes we're going to want to turn that assumption on. But what you'll see is when we generalize this structure, we may have subgroups that we define, not necessarily in the compliance framework, where we're going to not want to set that to 0. Okay, so for now, I'm defining all of these subgroup treatment effects without making assumptions or placing constraints on, one, whether these groups exist. We're going to do that, like getting rid of defiers, and 2, placing constraints on what those treatment effects can actually be, right? But that's going to be sort of the next step in the process. Does that help? Yeah? Okay.
But also just like something came up yesterday, it's not always takers have a 0 effect might not be an assumption
Mm-hmm.
So you could be an always taker in one case, and you get $5,000 in your pocket in one case, right? But it really changes the type of place that you go. So it's not always a good assumption.
Yep. But so in the case of two-stage least squares or IV, we need that assumption for estimation. So we're leaving aside estimation for the moment and just staying in the realm of defining things that we either do or possibly could care about. Yeah?
It seems like in this case, treatment, what the treatment is very different for these different groups, right? Like, treatment for the complier is going to be looking a lot different than treatment for the always taker, where for the always taker, they're going to experience whatever the treatment is supposed to be either way, but in one case they've been assigned to it, the other one they have not.
Right, exactly. So the thing that's randomized is the offer, right? So the thing that's actually randomized is the offer, and then the intermediate behavior is, do you experience the treatment or not? Okay. Ladies can have questions too. Okay, just say. Okay, so for most of the rest of the day, we'll be in the space of thinking about principal stratification, defining the groups that we care about. And see, I promised pictures rather than formulas, so we'll look at these boxes all day long. Okay, so this is the way that I like to think about or sort of visualize the groups that we might care about. Okay, so let's talk through the structure of this a little bit. So Z equals 1 is assignment to the treatment condition. Z equals 0 is assignment to the control condition. So over here, these are the potential values, right? So D equals to 1 is take up of the treatment under assignment to the treatment condition. D equals 0 is take up of not the treatment under assignment to the treatment condition. And similarly over here, when you're assigned to the control condition. Okay? So remember we said that strata membership is defined by what you would do if you're assigned to treatment and what you would do if you're assigned to control. And so our principal strata are these four groups at the intersection of these two sets of potential behaviors. Okay? So if we have somebody who would take up the treatment under assignment to the treatment condition and would take up treatment under assignment to the control condition, those are always takers. Okay? Similarly, our defiers, here are our compliers, and our never takers. So again, we're in the space of defining all of our groups without necessarily using assumptions yet to place constraints on whether they exist or what their ITT effects within the strata can be. Okay? Okay. So again, this is sort of the general structure that we like to use when we're thinking about defining these groups that we care about. Okay? Okay. So we can define them, we can think about them theoretically, even if we can't observe the groups that everybody belongs to. Okay? Okay. Those are just boxes to animate what I just said. Okay. So what's challenging is that if we have individuals over here, if we have individuals who are assigned to the treatment condition and they take up the treatment, if those are folks that we observe, we know that they are a combination of people who are always takers and people who are compliers. Right? So what we'd ideally like to be able to do is separate out the outcomes under assignment to the treatment condition for always takers. What's the distribution of the outcome if you're an always taker? And what's the distribution of the outcome if you're a complier? So notice there I'm saying the distribution of the outcome rather than the distribution of the treatment effect or something like that, right? So ideally what we would be able to do, or what we'd like to be able to do, is look at these outcomes for those who take up the treatment under assignment to the treatment condition and condition on this group membership to say outcomes look like this for people assigned to treatment if they're a complier, and outcomes look like this for people assigned to treatment if they're an always taker. and so forth. We'd like to be able to separate out those distributions. And we can't do that directly because group membership is not observed. Okay? So inherently, our outcome distributions for groups defined by treatment assignment and treatment take-up are mixtures of distributions, right? So, so our principal stratification problem or challenge is that sort of fundamentally, we'd like to be able to pull apart those mixtures into their unique components. The distribution of the outcome for underassignment to treatment, for the always takers versus the compliers, and similarly for all of the different groups, right? We'd like to be able to say, for always takers, what's the distribution of the outcome for always takers assigned to treatment, and what's the distribution of the outcome for always takers assigned to control, right? So we want to think about what the outcome would be under treatment and control for each of these groups. That's sort of, in our ideal world, that's what we would be able to get. Okay? Okay, so here's where we're going to say, we've defined in entirety all the groups that we might care about. Now let's start to apply some of these assumptions in order to simplify this problem, to begin to make it more tractable. Because the idea of separating out all of these different distributions is a hard thing to do, right? So how can we apply some assumptions justified by science, justified what we know about our field, justified by theory, to make progress and begin to simplify this picture? Okay. Okay. So now here's where we're going to walk through those IV assumptions that you've been hankering for. Okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to apply an IV or a monotonicity assumption. So this is our standard assumption stating that the potential value of the intermediate variable under assignment to treatment is at least as large as the potential value of the intermediate behavior under assignment to control. Okay? So what does that allow us to do? That allows us to get rid of our defiers. Okay? And so when you, after this, you're going to have in your small groups an opportunity to sort of reason through a few different principal stratification scenarios. And so, and you know, more complex than this, certainly. So after you define all of these possible groups, the next thing that you want to do is start sort of telling yourself some stories, right? So would it be reasonable that you would have somebody, you know, in whatever scenario that you're thinking about, who would be a defier? And if not, you know, obviously in the case of IV, we get rid of that group. And so you'll see with some of the examples that you walk through in your groups that there are, you'll be using things like a monotonicity assumption. There are a few other sort of flavors of assumptions like this that you can apply to get rid of some of the groups. But it's always going to be beneficial to eliminate as many possible groups as you can. Okay, so here we've gotten rid of the defiers. So we've assumed them away with a monotonicity assumption. Okay. Another thing that you can do is obviously apply something like an exclusion restriction. You can constrain outcomes. So again, in a standard IV setup, we would apply an exclusion restriction to make the assumption, it's an assumption that the treatment effect for always takers and never takers will be zero in those strata. But again, that's an assumption. We could think about these problems more generally without necessarily turning on that assumption. Okay? So we could, but we might also be in the space of sort of analytic problems or substantive problems where turning on those assumptions is not necessarily going to be a viable thing to do. It's not really justifiable. Okay? Are there any questions so far? No? Okay. Okay. So that's sort of the general setup that I wanted to offer. And then I want to turn to the idea, doing a long time, that we can use the same framework and process for articulating a variety of types of research questions. Okay, so far we've used the space of compliance to sort of articulate this general process of setting up these principal strata, these subgroups that we care about, and then turning on some assumptions to sort of simplify the number of groups or make statements about what treatment effects might be in certain of the cells. Right? But we can use this same framework and process for articulating a variety of types of research questions. So the first type of question that we could think about is, suppose we want to think about naturally occurring variation in the treatment condition. Right? Another way of saying that is that we could have different types of compliers. Right? So in the Head Start Impact Study, we had some compliers who, absent the offer of getting to enroll in Head Start, they stayed home with a parent. And then we had some compliers who, absent the offer to go to Head Start, instead, if they didn't get that offer, they went to another center-based childcare setting. And we might be substantively interested in, or we might sort of have theories about treatment effects in those two strata, may be sort of policy relevant, may be substantively meaningful, and they may not be the same. We may have a strong reason to believe that a treatment effect in one group could be really, really different from the treatment effect in another group, right? So we might want to think in a more nuanced way about who our compliers are, okay? We can use the principal stratification framework, we can generalize the principal stratification framework to separately define those different types of compliers. Okay, another example, so the terminology for this is really unfortunate. It grows again out of the sort of public health sector. So this kind of analysis first was referred to as truncation due to death, right? So you can think of wanting to measure something like a quality of life indicator, where the intervention that you're thinking about is some postoperative care or some experimental treatment after some adverse medical event, right? So somebody has a heart attack and they're assigned to a drug intervention or a, I don't know, I'm not a physician, some other intervention. And you want to think about how exposure to that intervention impacts their quality of life. So quality of life is not well defined if you're dead. And so in that case, you would only want to think about, or it would only be sort of appropriate to assess the impact of the intervention on quality of life for people who would be alive in either case. So there, you could think about defining strata. Your intermediate behavior is whether you lived, right? It's not whether you complied, it's whether you were alive or not. And then we could think about, well, in which of our strata, the always alive, the never alive, the sometimes alive, in which strata can we actually assess impact on quality of life? Okay, so that's another sort of generalization of this framework. Another one, and this gets closest to the idea of mediation, is the idea of a surrogate outcome. So you might think about one of the interventions that was brought up the other day is I think Mike Weiss talked about it, the MDRC study of career academy high schools. And so they had big effects on earnings after high school. And what's interesting about this study, this was my dissertation, so I could talk about it. What's interesting about this study is that randomization to treatment had basically zero impact on all of the standard sort of intermediate educational behaviors, right? So it had no impact on high school graduation, it had no impact on college going, it had no impact on test scores, it had no impact on grades, all of that kind of stuff. But then downstream, much longer down the road, it had these big impacts on earnings. And so what I looked at is here I defined that intermediate behavior by exposure to sort of the labor market activities of their career academy high school, right? So did they participate in things like internships and job shadowing and blah blah blah, all of those things that I sort of built into a composite and said we're going to call that labor market exposure. And then ask the question, are treatment effects largest for the subgroup of kids who also experience the biggest difference in exposure to the labor market by virtue of random assignment to the Career Academy High School? So there, the intermediate behavior is sort of take up of labor market activities, right? And you would want to think about, well, there are some kids who might have little difference in experience with the labor market under assignment to treatment or control. And then there are some kids who might experience really different exposure to the labor market under assignment to treatment or control. And if we can sort of define groups in that way, might it be that treatment effects are different for those different types of kids? Okay. In all of these cases, the process to formulate and set up the problem is really similar in each case. Okay? Okay. So in general, to utilize this kind of framework, you want to be able to sort of clearly articulate and define or answer these kinds of questions. So what's the treatment that was randomized? What's the intermediate behavior of interest, and how are we going to define that really carefully? What are our strata? What are the outcomes of interest? So we've answered 1 through 4 before applying anything like monotonicity, before applying anything like exclusion restriction. It's just defining the groups that we care about. And then in 5, we also want to ask the question, and this relates to that truncation due to death application, in which strata is the treatment effect well defined, right? In which strata is there actually a clearly defined treatment control contrast? And then it's step 6, where after we've set up the whole shebang, where then we can start to apply these assumptions to say, which strata can I reasonably rule out? What's the story that I'm going to tell? What's the assumption that I'm going to apply to argue that? Is that justifiable? And in which strata, if any, am I going to constrain the treatment effects in order to make the estimation problem more tractable? Okay? So all of this, really steps 1 through 5, are setting up our estimands, defining our estimands, the things that we want to estimate really, really carefully. And then step 6 is sort of our, like, let's get ready for estimation. How do we make this an easier problem to handle? Okay? Yeah?
I don't know what my question is, but I'm thinking about, so we've been talking about treatment effect heterogeneity, and you gave an example on the last slide of naturally occurring variation in the control setting. Is there a difference that we should be thinking about with naturally occurring variation in the treatment setting? Like, was that an example for a specific reason, and what's...
So it's an example for, it's a paper that I wrote with Luke and Avi and Todd, so it's an example that I know. But so let's think about variation in the treatment experience that might be relevant. So is there something off the top of your head that you're thinking of?
The quality of the place you're going is could happen in the control or the treatment.
Exactly, exactly.
So it would be fine to set it up that way.
That's right, that's right. So maybe you want to think about, and this was, so we were part of this team that was doing all sorts of reanalysis with the Head Start impact study. And one group was really interested in asking the question of, well, like, what's the impact of Head Start if it's high quality Head Start versus what's the impact of Head Start if it's kind of shitty Head Start, right? Technically speaking. And so there you're thinking about strata that are defined by high quality child care experience or high quality Head Start experience versus low quality Head Start or low quality child care experience. So you can absolutely have that kind of variation in both the control setting and the treatment setting.
And you wouldn't think about that as a moderator because it's it's not like the rural urban, like some settings are like this and some are like this before we even start. Like, or is there a difference between that kind of rural versus urban versus high quality versus not?
You know, I think that the mediator moderator vocabulary doesn't translate perfectly to principal stratification, and so because of that, I tend to just not try. And so, like, here we can clearly define like what are the groups that we care about, and then we can think substantively about them without necessarily applying that kind of vocabulary.
Why doesn't it apply? Like, I'm also trying to think of a
Yeah.
difference.
So think about a nice example is this sort of surrogate outcome example. And I think it has to do, or it relates to this Sutra assumption, right? So in principal stratification, the strata membership, or the idea of strata membership really sort of forces you down the road of thinking about strata. Membership in strata means that there are different kinds of people, right? Just like there are boys and there are girls. And so if I'm the kind of person who is going to comply and do just what I'm told, or I'm the kind of person that's going to experience a big change in exposure to the labor market, and I have big treatment effects, I'm different, I'm distinct from the kind of person who's not going to experience a big difference in labor market exposure. And so if you compare me, who had this big difference in exposure, to somebody else who is a different kind of person who experienced a little bit of change, to say that this big treatment effect and this little treatment effect, that the differences between those is caused by that difference in labor market exposure is, it's applying a sort of causal interpretation to what's essentially a descriptive comparison. Right? So the results of that study are consistent with the hypothesis that exposure to the labor market is sort of the mediator, right? Is the driving factor, but is it sort of is it bulletproof evidence? No, not necessarily. So a lot of people who have done this kind of work have said, this kind of analysis is sort of, it's in a way like inherently exploratory, right? And so we could, again, that analysis is like consistent with the hypothesis that exposure to the labor market is sort of the key mechanism, but it's not sort of bulletproof evidence. Would you add anything to that, Sean?
Yeah, I used to think I knew what the difference between mediation and moderation was. And I used to be confused by people who were confused by it. Now I'm more appreciative of their confusion and less sure of my own uncertainty. So I think it's sort of like, is it a kind of, in your example, is there a kind of person who just would have had bigger effects, and that kind of person happens to be in sort of settings where they end up with more labor market experience, but it's just a correlate or a marker or a property, but it's not a causal thing.
Right.
In that sense, it's not a mediator, it's not a moderator, it's just like a correlated characteristic of a kind of person,
Right.
descriptive. But if you sort of imagine that it's the active ingredient somehow, it's the mediator, and I think we don't control that, and so I don't know. So I think it's very hard to think about when you get to say it's a causal mediator and not just say it's a type of person or it's a type of person setting kind of relationship.
Right.
So I'm less sure of this distinction.
Yeah. So this is a great place, I think, to contrast what Guanglei is going to do tomorrow, where she relies on a different assumption, right? She says, well, if we can condition on everything that we, like the actual baseline characteristics, if we can condition on gender and SES and race and ethnicity and like all the things in education that we usually control for, her approach is going to argue that conditional on those things, the level of the mediator that you experience is as good as random, right? So that's a fundamental, that's a big assumption, right? Conditional on all of those characteristics, the level of this intermediate variable is as good as random. It's as good as a flip of a coin.
But it's also, in that it's not predetermined. So this framework it's a pre-treatment characteristic of the person, as you said a couple times, right?
Yep.
And in her model, it's like I could still be me, and I could get z equals 1, but then there's some mysterious coin flip that could get me z equals 1 or z equals 0 that's not set in stone. And so I often struggle with trying to decide then what is, like I don't quite know how to think about that.
Yeah.
So that seems to be a key distinction between how you think about this approach and
Right.
how you think about her approach.
Right. Yep. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
In that case, is the term conditional the same as controlled?
Yeah.
That's just like not the way the world works.
Talk with her about that tomorrow.
All right, sorry. All right. That's not the way the world works. Like the experience. Oh, you said. What was the statement you made?
So the idea that like controlling for all these baseline analytically controlling for all these baseline characteristics, like whether you get high quality head start or low quality head start, is conditional, whether you get high quality or low quality is as good as random.
And I'm saying that that's saying like the experience of, let's say, black students and white students is the same.
Well, no.
Or not the same, or controlling.
There's a key aspect. It's as good as random, meaning that if you found two students that had the exact same
That's right.
they would each have the same chance of low versus high. Some of the
Yes.
students, they might both have a very high chance of going to high quality. Other students might have a very low chance of going to high quality. But the idea is if you can find these two students that are basically all equivalently the same, except one happened to go to high, one happened to go to low, then you can compare them.
So both of those students, like if all those baseline characteristics are the same, both students were exposed to the same 70-30 coin flip, and one of them went one way and one of them went the other. But their probability of that coin flip was the same.
But you're right, and that's why we, in those contexts, we spend so much time looking at the baseline comparison, because the world doesn't work that way. You've only got to sort of find homogeneous enough groups that the world within that group does work. And it might be you're running a randomized experiment where almost everybody gets treatment. You might be running a randomized experiment where almost nobody gets treatment in a particular group. But then you can sort of imagine analyzing each of those groups and then averaging across all the groups. And so basically what you're going to see tomorrow, and I don't know if you've had exposure to sort of classic observational study, causal inference and observational study, like you do matching, propensity search, something like that. What you're going to see tomorrow is basically migrating the observational study machinery to the context of mediation, which what that's really telling you is that the random assignment is not giving you your estimates of your mean. It is your observational study machinery that is making these estimates. So you're doing a treatment, you're analyzing a randomized treatment to get your overall average impacts, and then you're separating those average impacts by doing an observational study inside your universe. And that might, if you have prior experience, that might help orient sort of what's happening.
That's great. Thanks. Anything else? I'm liking the conversation. Okay. All right. We're perfectly on time. This could not be going any better. Okay. So we talked through the idea of these different questions that you want to answer with your principal stratification framework. We're not going to have a break. We're going to keep going because there are a couple of other slides that I want to get through, and then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to break up into groups. So hang with me. Okay, so what I want to do, so we've talked about setting up a principal stratification problem in the space of compliance, and together I want to set one up where we're thinking about a different kind of problem. So this is a truncation by death problem. And so if you've heard about Lee bounds, which I think people have talked about before, it comes from this paper by David Lee from 2009. where he was studying, and lots of people have used these data, a job training program. And in this job training program, he was basically interested in asking the question, well, okay, in this job training program, there was this positive effect on earnings. So overall, like what you took home in a month, or overall what you took home in a year. And he wanted to ask the question, well, is this positive effect on total earnings a function of increased employment? Are more people just working and earning the same? So we would think about that for the economist in the room as like the extensive margin. Or is it an increased wage rate, right? Is it the intensive margin? Or is it both? So any improvement, but the challenge, the thing that's hard, is that we can only observe somebody's wage rate if they're actually in the labor market, right? So if we just compared the wage rate in the control group to the wage rate in the treatment group, that's going to be sort of a fraught comparison if we don't do something else, because having a wage rate observed is conditional on actually being employed. And the probability of your employment is also being impacted by randomization to the job training program. Okay? So the goal in this analysis is try to pull those two things apart. Okay? Okay. So in this research question, is the study of this job training program, is the positive effect on earnings a function of increased employment or increased wage rate or both? So we can just go through this exercise, right? So our treatment, the randomized treatment, the thing that's actually randomized, is the offer of the job training program. The outcome that we're interested in here is hourly wage. And the key intermediate behavior, now how we're going to define our strata, is whether you're employed or not, right? Are you employed or not under assignment to the treatment condition? Are you employed or not under assignment to the control condition? Okay, so we're moving away from this idea of compliance. And here's just a quote that I pulled right from the paper that helps to articulate nicely why we want to think about these two different sort of possible mechanisms, really, separated from each other. Okay. So in our principal stratification framework, this is how we would begin, right? So we want to think, well, here's assignment to the treatment condition. My key intermediate behavior is, am I employed or not? And then we want to think about the same thing if I'm assigned to the control condition. Under assignment to the control condition, am I employed or am I not employed? And we want to sort of cross-reference these two sets of possibilities to define the groups that we care about, right? To define our principal strata. Okay, so we can use, this is sort of generalizing that language of the groups that we care about in instrumental variables, right? So here is my group who are always going to be employed. Whether they participate in that job training program or not, they're always going to have a job. Here are folks who are basically our kind of our compliers, right? They're going to be employed if they're treated, but not employed if they're not. Well, I don't know if that's a complier, but they correspond to our compliers. Here are never employed folks. And here are folks who would be employed if they're not treated. So when we set up the compliance example, remember one of the first things that we did, so we've defined our groups. And now we can go through the process of sort of simplifying our groups, right? So one of the first questions that we might ask ourselves is, are there any groups that we can get rid of? Can we assume anybody away? And so what do you guys, I know it's written in the slides, so don't look, but so employed if not treated, can we assume them away? You're shaking your head vigorously, that's good, you heard me. Why?
Well, it could be that you took a minimum wage job, you did the job training program, but maybe you learned a new skill, you try to get into that field, you just can't find some employment there.
Right, right. So maybe the job training program sort of raised your standards for what an acceptable job is, right? And if you have these new high standards and you can't get a job to meet those new high standards, maybe we wouldn't be happy with the no defiers assumption, with the monotonicity assumption. So that was basically the question that I asked there. For now, I'm going to say, like, yeah, it's totally fine for this example. But it's a great example of where just sort of blithely applying a monotonicity assumption isn't necessarily going to be justifiable. Estimation is going to be a lot easier if we can make that assumption. So my advice is for your dissertation, don't do anything where you can't apply the monotonicity assumption. Okay. Okay, so let's look over here. So in these strata, so here are folks who are employed if treated or folks who are never employed. So this is one of those quality of life examples, right? So if people aren't consistently in the labor market, here, if they're employed if treated, we can observe their wage rate under assignment to the treatment condition, but we don't observe a wage rate under assignment to the control condition, right? So in this cell, we don't actually have a well-defined ITT effect when our outcome is wages, right? Because we can't observe what the wage rate would be under assignment to the control condition. And similarly, in this group, never employed, we're never observing wage rates for these folks, right? So the idea of what we would like to be able to do is, in theory, identify those folks who are always going to be employed under assignment to the treatment condition and under assignment to the control condition, and within that group, estimate our ITT effect. And so in the Lee paper, and this is the kind of exercise that we're going to be doing for the afternoon, what he basically says is, okay, we can't identify those folks who are always going to be employed, but we can use information on the margins, and this is what we'll do this afternoon. We can use information on the margins over here and on the margins over here to ask ourselves or to investigate how big or small the treatment effect could actually be in this cell. Okay? In the space of truncation by death, if you want to learn more about this, one piece of terminology that's often used is the survivor average causal effect. Okay, so relating back to that example of quality of life, you can only estimate an effect on quality of life for people who would survive, people who would be employed under assignment to treatment and under assignment to control. Okay, just in case you're searching around for these kinds of papers. Liz Stewart, and I forget, Devaney, and there's one other author. They have a great sort of review paper, or just sort of great introduction paper on truncation by death from a couple years ago in like Prevention Science or something like that. Anyway, if you're interested in it, I can send you the citation. So it's a great paper. Okay, so now we're going to take a break, and maybe I'll set this up now so that you know what's coming next, and after a break you can just come right to your groups. In the back, there's a set of group exercises. And what I've basically done, what we've put together is sort of 3 different scenarios for setting up, for doing a principal stratification setup. And what I'd like to have happen is for each group, I think it actually works, there are like 18 people. It might work, and there are 3 of us, so that works well. So can we divide up into 3 groups? Let's count off by 3s, is that okay? So there are 3 different exercises. What I'd like, you're accountable this time. So what I'd like is for group 1 to do the first one first, group 2 to do the second one first, group 3 to do the third one first. And we're going to actually like roll up the board. You're going to have to slap your setup on the board and explain it to the group. So and we'll just sort of talk through it. As a group, do your assigned one first, but then, of course, take time. I think there'll be time to look at the other ones as well. So let's take a break for 15 minutes, and then we can come back together.